Imagine a nation tearing itself apart, not from foreign invasion but from within. Brothers turned against brothers, fathers against sons, neighbors against neighbors. The year is 1861. America, a young nation barely 85 years old, finds itself at the brink of collapse. The air is heavy with fear, the streets echo with heated debates, and whispers of secession spread like wildfire. Soon, the sound of cannon fire will replace the voices of compromise. This is not just a story of war. It is a story of ideals, of freedom, of survival. The American Civil War wasn't inevitable, but once it began, nothing would ever be the same. By the mid-1800s, the United States stood at a dangerous crossroads. Expansion had given the young republic vast new territories, but it also revived a question that refused to die. Would slavery spread, or would it be contained? Each time America grew, the argument returned with greater fury. The North, industrializing rapidly, saw slavery as both a moral wrong and an economic competitor. The South, deeply tied to cotton and dependent on enslaved labor, saw its way of life under threat. Two visions of America, one free, one bound, faced each other like storm clouds ready to collide. Was war truly the only outcome? Or could statesmen have pulled the nation back from the brink? In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a man little known outside Illinois just a few years earlier, was elected president. His victory was the spark that set the South ablaze with fear. Lincoln had promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, yet Southerners believed his rise marked the beginning of slavery's death. One by one, Southern states declared secession. South Carolina was the first on December 20, 1860. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By February 1861, 7 states had torn themselves from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. Could these states legally leave? The Constitution offered no clear answer, and so the nation split, not just in law, but in blood. In Washington, fear and uncertainty reigned. Lincoln had not yet even taken office when the Union seemed to crumble beneath him. Outgoing President James Buchanan declared that secession was illegal, but claimed he had no power to stop it. Imagine the anxiety. The president-elect preparing to lead a nation that might no longer exist. Would Lincoln use force to hold the Union together? Or would he let the South go, hoping the fracture might heal with time? This was no longer just politics. It was survival. At the heart of the crisis lay one brutal reality: slavery. For decades, compromises had delayed confrontation. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each patched the wound but never healed it. But now, with secession, there could be no compromise left. The South argued it fought for states' rights. Yet what was that right but the right to keep men and women in chains? Here lies a haunting question for us today. Was the Civil War fought for liberty or for the preservation of oppression? On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office. His words were calm yet firm. He would not start a war, but he would preserve the Union. Secession, he declared, was unconstitutional. The Union was perpetual, unbreakable. But Lincoln faced a terrible dilemma: how to show strength without provoking further secession. 4 border states, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained undecided. If they left, the Union might collapse entirely. Suspense thickened. Would Lincoln's careful words hold the nation together, or would the powder keg ignite anyway? The true test came in Charleston, South Carolina, at Fort Sumter. Union troops, loyal to Washington, still occupied the fort, but Confederate forces surrounded it. Supplies dwindled. Lincoln faced his first great decision. Should he abandon the fort and appear weak, or resupply it and risk war? He chose a middle path, sending only food, not weapons. But the Confederacy would not allow even bread to pass. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire. For 34 hours, smoke and flame consumed the harbor skies. The Union surrendered. The Civil War had begun. Think of it. War unleashed not by invasion, not by conquest, but by Americans upon Americans. Could the leaders of 1861 have chosen differently? Could compromise have delayed bloodshed another generation? Or was the clash truly unavoidable, born from contradictions too deep to reconcile? And here is a question I want you to answer. If you lived then, would you have supported Lincoln's fight to preserve the Union, or the South's demand for independence? Comment your thoughts. I'll be watching to see which side today's audience would have stood upon. The attack on Fort Sumter electrified the North. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. Crowds filled the streets, cheering for the Union. Young men rushed to enlist, their faces burning with patriotic fervor. But in the South, Lincoln's call to arms was seen as an act of tyranny. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, 4 great states, now joined the Confederacy. The line was drawn. 23 states remained loyal to the Union. 11 stood with the Confederacy. America was split, North against South. Picture this chilling truth. Families divided overnight. A father in Kentucky loyal to the Union, his son marching for the Confederacy. Brothers facing one another across battle lines, each ready to kill in the name of their cause. Could any war cut deeper than this? The first major clash came at Bull Run in July 1861. Crowds of Northern civilians picnicked on the hills, expecting to watch a quick Union victory. Instead, they witnessed chaos. Confederate forces under General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson stood firm. Union soldiers fled in panic. The dream of a short war shattered. This would be a long, bloody struggle. The end of 1861, the nation was entrenched in conflict. Thousands had already fallen. But the war was only beginning. Battles greater, bloodier, and more decisive lay ahead. The fate of millions, free and enslaved alike, would soon hinge on decisions made in smoky war rooms and muddy battlefields. Before we dive deeper, I want to hear from you. If you lived in 1861, which side do you think you would have supported? The Union or the Confederacy, and why? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll be reading everyone. And don't forget to subscribe now. Part 3 holds secrets you cannot miss. The smoke rising from Fort Sumter had barely settled when the entire United States erupted into chaos. The bombardment on that April morning in 1861 was not just the first battle. It was the thunderclap that shattered decades of fragile compromise. By the time the Union garrison finally surrendered, the nation knew there was no turning back. War was here. President Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers electrified the North, but it also drove a wedge that tore even deeper through the South. 4 more states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, chose to secede, joining the Confederacy. Suddenly, Richmond, Virginia, only 100 miles from Washington, D.C., became the new Confederate capital. The war was no longer distant. It was at the Union's doorstep. The spring and summer of 1861 brought a feverish mobilization never before seen on American soil. Ordinary farmers, clerks, teachers, and shopkeepers rushed to enlist, many believing the conflict would last only a few weeks. Young men donned bright uniforms, some even stitched by mothers and sisters at home, marching through towns to the sound of drums and cheers. But beneath the patriotic excitement lurked a grim truth. Neither side was prepared. The Union Army was disorganized, its officers inexperienced. The Confederacy, though spirited, lacked factories, railroads, and weapons, yet both believed destiny favored them. July 21st, 1861, the rolling fields near Manassas, Virginia, became the stage for the first major clash, the Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas. Crowds of civilians from Washington rode out in carriages, carrying picnic baskets, expecting to watch a quick Union victory. At first, it seemed they might be right. Union troops pushed back the Confederates, who wavered under the assault. But then came a rallying cry. General Thomas Jonathan Jackson stood firm on Henry House Hill. A fellow officer shouted, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." From that moment, Jackson was immortalized as Stonewall Jackson, and the Confederacy surged back with renewed fury. The Union lines collapsed into chaos. Soldiers fled in panic, civilians scattered, and Washington trembled at the thought that the war might end in disaster before it had truly begun. Imagine being a soldier that day, marching confidently, only to watch your comrades break and run, the enemy screaming in triumph. Would you have stood your ground? Or would fear have carried your legs faster than reason? After Bull Run, both sides realized this would not be a quick war. Lincoln called for 500,000 more soldiers. The Confederacy too tightened its defenses, believing its cause just as sacred. The Union devised the Anaconda Plan, a strategy to choke the South's economy by blockading its ports and seizing control of the Mississippi River. Slowly, methodically, the Union Navy expanded, capturing key points along the southern coast. But on land, momentum shifted constantly. Skirmishes erupted in Missouri and Kentucky, where families and even neighbors split their loyalties. In some towns, brothers fought brothers, fathers fought sons. The Civil War was not just a conflict between North and South, it was a war within households. Far from Washington and Richmond, another struggle unfolded in the Mississippi Valley. A little-known brigadier general named Ulysses S. Grant began carving his reputation. In early 1862, he captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. When Confederate officers asked for surrender terms, Grant famously demanded unconditional and immediate surrender. The phrase, "unconditional surrender Grant," made headlines across the Union. But triumph soon met horror. April 1862, at a quiet church called Shiloh Meeting House in Tennessee, Union troops awoke to the thunder of Confederate guns. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the bloodiest encounters yet. Men who had expected glory found themselves knee-deep in mud, blood, and terror. Nearly 24,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Here's a chilling thought. If you had survived that day, would the memories of screams and gunfire haunt you forever? While soldiers clashed on land, a revolution occurred at sea. In March 1862, the world witnessed the first duel of ironclad warships, the Union's USS Monitor versus the Confederacy CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimack. For 4 hours, the two iron monsters hammered each other, cannonballs bouncing off iron hulls in a battle unlike anything seen before. The age of wooden warships was over. The future belonged to iron and steel. Back in the East, Union General George B. McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign, aiming to capture Richmond. With a massive army, he inched his way up Virginia's peninsula, cautious at every turn. McClellan believed he was outnumbered, though in truth his forces often dwarfed the Confederates. But hesitation can be deadlier than defeat. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, recently placed in command, exploited every pause. Through deception, bold maneuvers, and relentless aggression, Lee transformed the war. He was not merely defending, he was reshaping the battlefield. The 7 days' battles drove McClellan back, crushing Union hopes of a swift victory. Why did McClellan, commanding one of the largest armies the continent had ever seen, hesitate so often? Was it caution or fear? By late summer 1862, the Confederacy struck again at Manassas. The Second Battle of Bull Run was another humiliating defeat for the Union. Spirits in the North plummeted. In contrast, the Confederacy felt emboldened. Robert E. Lee now made a daring decision: take the war into Union territory. His goal? To strike fear, win foreign recognition, and perhaps force the North to negotiate peace. His army marched into Maryland. The stage was set for one of the most pivotal battles of the entire war. September 17, 1862. Near Sharpsburg, Maryland, the Union and Confederate armies collided in a day of unparalleled carnage. From dawn until dusk, waves of soldiers fought through cornfields, across bridges, and in a sunken road that became forever known as Bloody Lane. By nightfall, nearly 23,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing, the single bloodiest day in American history. Though tactically inconclusive, Antietam forced Lee to retreat back into Virginia. For the Union, it was the first glimmer of strategic success. The outcome of Antietam gave Abraham Lincoln the confidence to issue a preliminary announcement, the Emancipation Proclamation. Beginning January 1, 1863, all slaves in rebellious states would be declared free. The war was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was now about freedom. This changed everything. European powers, hesitant to support a slaveholding Confederacy, pulled back. The moral compass of the war shifted dramatically. Think about this. If Antietam had ended in Confederate victory, would Lincoln have dared to issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Would slavery have endured longer on American soil? By the end of 1862, the war had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. The Union had tasted both victory and bitter defeat. The Confederacy, though battered, stood defiant. Families mourned, soldiers hardened, and the world watched to see which way the tide would turn. But the coming year, 1863, would bring unimaginable horrors and decisive battles. Gettysburg loomed on the horizon, and with it, the fate of a nation. Will the Union finally break the Confederacy's momentum? Or will the South strike a blow that changes history forever? Before we dive into the next brutal chapter of the Civil War, I need your support. Smash that subscribe button to keep this history alive, and drop a comment. Do you think the Union or the Confederacy had the upper hand at this stage? Your thoughts might spark a fiery debate below. The war had entered a stage no one had imagined in 1861. By 1862, both sides had endured shocking defeats and surprising victories, but nothing could prepare the nation for the scale of bloodshed that was to come. The early dreams of a quick conflict were long gone. Instead, America was sinking deeper into a nightmare that threatened to consume the Union itself. The Union, still reeling from the disastrous first battle at Bull Run, regrouped under General George B. McClellan, a man both admired and criticized. McClellan was young, intelligent, and adored by his men, but his cautious nature frustrated President Lincoln. He always seemed to see phantom armies larger than his own, always convinced the Confederates had more strength than they truly did. This hesitation, while earning him respect among his soldiers for avoiding reckless slaughter, made him a controversial figure in Washington. Meanwhile, in the West, the Union found a rising star, Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike McClellan, Grant was bold, aggressive, and relentless. In February 1862, his victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee gave the Union its first major successes. It was here that Grant earned his famous nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant, after he demanded exactly that from the Confederate garrison at Fort Donelson. The victory electrified the North and put the Confederacy on the defensive in the Western theater. But every victory seemed to come with a cruel twist. Only weeks later, the Battle of Shiloh erupted in April 1862, and what unfolded there shocked the nation. Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack on Grant's camp in Tennessee. For 2 days, the fighting was relentless, brutal, and bloody beyond belief. By the end, over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, numbers the United States had never experienced before. Shiloh shattered any remaining illusions that the war could be short or relatively painless. Imagine for a moment being a farmer in Ohio or Georgia, reading the newspaper as casualty lists stretched column after column. The sheer scale of death became almost incomprehensible. Families across the nation were forced to grapple with the reality that this war was unlike anything in living memory. Did the leaders on either side truly understand what they had unleashed? In the East, McClellan finally launched his long-awaited Peninsular Campaign in the spring of 1862. With over 100,000 troops, it was one of the largest armies ever assembled in North America. His plan was to move up the Virginia Peninsula and capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. At first, the plan seemed promising. Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston fell back under the pressure, and Richmond appeared to be within reach. But then fate intervened. Johnston was badly wounded, and Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, replaced him with Robert E. Lee. Up to this point, Lee had not been seen as a great field commander, but that perception was about to change forever. Lee immediately took the offensive. In what became known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee launched aggressive assaults that caught McClellan off guard. Though the Confederates suffered heavy casualties, their relentless attacks unnerved McClellan, who convinced himself that he was hopelessly outnumbered. By the end, McClellan retreated, and the opportunity to take Richmond was lost. This was a turning point. Lee had transformed himself into a legend in the Confederate ranks. His audacity, his willingness to take risks, and his ability to inspire his men stood in stark contrast to McClellan's caution. The South, though battered, found hope in Lee's leadership. The North, on the other hand, grew increasingly frustrated with McClellan's inability to deliver a decisive blow. While these massive battles raged, another factor began to influence the war: slavery. At the start, Lincoln had framed the conflict as a struggle to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. He feared losing the support of the border states that still allowed slavery, but had remained loyal to the Union. Yet, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the pressure to strike at the heart of the Southern economy and moral foundation grew stronger. Enslaved men and women themselves pushed this issue into the open. Thousands escaped to Union lines, forcing the army and government to decide, were these people contraband of war, or were they, in fact, free? Union generals like Benjamin Butler declared that since enslaved people were being used to support the Confederate war effort, the Union could confiscate them just as they would weapons or supplies. Slowly, step by step, the idea of emancipation moved from the edges to the center of the conflict. By mid-1862, Lincoln began drafting what would later become the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet, he hesitated to issue it until the Union had a significant military victory. Releasing such a declaration after repeated defeats would make it appear desperate. He needed leverage, and the war was not cooperating. The summer of 1862 brought more disaster for the Union in the East. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, General Lee and his brilliant cavalry commander J.E.B. Stuart humiliated the Union forces under General John Pope. Once again, the Union Army stumbled backward, morale sinking ever lower. The Confederacy, emboldened by its victories, now set its sights on a bold new goal: invasion of the North. Lee believed that by taking the war onto Union soil, he could not only gather supplies from Maryland, but also perhaps encourage European powers like Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. This decision led directly to one of the most famous battles of the entire war, Antietam. On September 17, 1862, the Union and Confederate armies clashed near Sharpsburg, Maryland. What followed was the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing by nightfall. Entire fields were soaked in blood. The cornfield, the Bloody Lane, and Burnside's Bridge became names etched in infamy. And yet, despite the horror, Antietam ended without a clear victor. The Confederates withdrew, giving Lincoln just enough of a claim to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The war's meaning shifted forever. But ask yourself, was this really a turning point? The Union had stopped Lee, yes, but at an unbearable cost. Could the North sustain such losses and still hold public support? Would the South, even without European recognition, be able to fight long enough to exhaust the Union's will? The answers to these questions were far from clear in 1862. The suspense of this moment is almost unbearable. Both sides had tasted victory and defeat. Both had suffered losses unimaginable just a year earlier, and both were locked in a conflict that seemed to have no end. The Union had the resources, but did it have the leadership? The Confederacy had brilliant generals, but did it have the manpower? Could McClellan ever overcome his fear of risk and deliver a crushing blow to Lee? Would Lincoln truly follow through on emancipation, risking even greater division within the Union? Could the Confederacy's gamble of invading the North actually break Union morale? Or was America doomed to even bloodier years ahead?